Yes, it is. Very famous painting. Let me give you, there we go. Now it's back again. All right, let me give you a few details that Gary did not touch on. First of all, I want to talk about the weather and field conditions. This was February, and typically that is the coldest month of the year in South Carolina. In addition to that, it had been raining 38 out of the last 45 days. So what you see before you is probably not 100% accurate. My guess is that whole area was like a mud pit. If you had some four wheelers and wanted to go mud pitting back then, you probably would have found an ideal place. The other factor was both sides wore wool uniforms. And as we all well know who have worn wool, that it soaks up water very quickly. So if you can imagine the coldest and wettest and most uncomfortable you've ever been and double it, you can probably approximate how the combatants in this battle felt. Uh, Gary did point out that there was very little trees there. The other point I want to make is because of the muck and the mud, it made troop movements, cavalry movements, and cannon fire much more difficult. And the distances were probably much greater than they normally would have been on a dry battlefield. Okay, any questions on that so far? All right, hearing none, let's go to the next slide, John.
Okay.
Okay, going back to Gary's comments, some of it was a little bit muted, but I'll just share with you a couple of things here. Sherman obviously wanted to conquer South Carolina, and he really had it in for Columbia. In addition to the fact that Columbia was a major railhead, there were a great number of factories in Columbia. That railhead was shipping materials and supplies, including farm goods, ammunition. There was an ammunition factory in Columbia. There was even a factory that made all the buttons for Civil War uniforms, Confederate uniforms. And he knew if he could shut down that railroad, he would restrict the amount of materials and supplies that the Confederate troops around the Charlotte area, Raleigh, and beyond were able to obtain. The second reason he was so angry at South Carolina was because the Articles of Secession were signed in Columbia. And so he felt like it was his job to punish Columbia. Now, as he was coming up from Savannah, and by the way, there are two different theories about why Sherman did not destroy Savannah. One theory, probably the more popular one, is that because Sherman had been stationed there at some point in time, that he had an affinity for the area, maybe even knew some people there. The truth of the matter is, he was actually stationed at one time in South Carolina at Fort Moultrie. The most logical explanation for why he did not destroy Savannah was because they needed an open port in addition to Charleston. They were hoping to reclaim Charleston. They needed an open port where they could ship goods and materials and supplies and personnel and offload them. So Savannah gave them an option if Charleston was not obtainable. Now, Sherman was a pretty good tactician, and he didn't want the Confederate troops to know exactly what he was doing. And so he broke his group in half, and he had one half go in the general direction of Charleston, and that was sort of a feint movement, while his real objective was Columbia. Now, there were several smaller battles fought prior to the Battle of Congaree Creek. Congaree Creek was basically the last-ditch effort to stop Sherman's troops from getting into Columbia. There was a battle at Rivers Bridge, and there's a South Carolina state park called Rivers Bridge, and they have a very good battlefield there. They also have some earthworks, but they're not nearly as extensive as the ones at Congaree Creek. And in fact, theirs were rebuilt at some point in time. Then there was a battle at Sandy Run, and finally the battle at Congaree Creek. Now, another interesting factor about the Congaree Creek combatants, there were no or very few South Carolina Confederate soldiers at the Battle of Congaree Creek. I know that may shock some of you, but most of the troops in South Carolina had been sent north. They were on their way to Raleigh to reinforce the troops that General Lee had. And so the people at Congaree Creek were backfilled from other areas. The majority of the Confederate combatants on February 15th were from Kentucky and Tennessee. I believe there were a few from Alabama and maybe a handful from other states. But the majority of the combatants at Congaree Creek for the Confederates were from other states. All right. Once Sherman was able to get to Columbia, that one battle at Congaree Creek and the other two battles prior to that did have a positive effect, although they didn't keep Columbia from being destroyed. But during that period of time, it delayed Sherman's troops just long enough for all the factories in the Columbia area to be totally emptied out. Everything they had was put on the trains and sent north towards Rock Hill and Charlotte. So there was one thing accomplished, although in the end, it really didn't make much difference. Okay, any questions? All right, hearing none, let's go to the next slide. Okay, Gary already addressed these a little bit. This is just the LiDAR images of the tête de pont. The tête de pont is a French word, and it basically means a small fortification. What they did was they built it across the state road, and it was logs and fence rails and things like that that would prevent or make it difficult for troops to come up. Now, most records indicate that the Confederates only had 2 cannons, and I'll touch on that a little bit more lately, but they had 2 Napoleon-style cannons, which they employed on either side of the tête de pont, which gave them a clean field of fire going down State Road from which the Union troops were coming. And by the way, they were coming loaded. Their wagon train probably stretched 10 miles. They had engineers, they had medics, they had food wagons, ammunition wagons, everything you can imagine, and coming up that state road.
You mean the Confederates? Or
the Union soldiers had those.
Union. Okay.
Yeah. Confederates were greatly outnumbered. But Sherman didn't travel second class. He traveled first class. And they even had bridge makers. So if the Confederates had been able to destroy the Congaree Creek Bridge at that time, they could have fairly quickly rebuilt another one. Now, the movement was slow because of all the rain and mud. So they weren't coming at any rapid speed. But there were certainly enough of them that at some point they had to abandon the tête de pont, and they moved those cannons back. We know that the Confederates had 2 Napoleon-style cannons that were either 10-pound or 12-pound, and there's some records that indicate we may have had a Parrott gun, which was a rifle-barreled, basically a large rifle on wheels. We don't know how much effect they had, probably not very much. And I even questioned the comment from one of the engineers after the battle that the Union soldiers' cannons fired to great effect. I don't know if you've ever thrown firecrackers into mud, but it doesn't do a whole lot of damage. And what gets damaged gets fixed right back real quickly. And remember, the entire time of this battle, it was raining. Okay, any questions? All right, let's just go to the next slide, John. Okay, again, this is just an overview. The red indicates where Confederate troops were. The blue indicates where the Union troops were. And most of this took place along Old State Road, which, by the way, is currently runs into State Street in Casey, just to give you some perspective. Okay, any questions on that one? All right, let's
Chuck,
go to
you
the next one, John.
want to point out, are you going to talk about their retreat after they were outflanked?
Yes.
Okay.
At one point, the Union troops were able to cross Congaree Creek. Now, there's a couple of speculations. One is that there were some downed trees and I guess the northwestern portion of the earthworks. And they were able to use those trees, and perhaps they constructed some kind of a small bridge. But once they found an opening, the Union troops came across. Well, they were greatly outnumbered to begin with. And as they started coming around, it put them in a position. If you look over on the lower left-hand side of the map, right about where it says bridge, that gave them an opening, and they were able to come, if they had been completely successful, they were able to come around and flank the Confederate troops. They were hiding behind the walls at the earthworks. So they bugged out. Most believe that they went through what was the Casey area into to Columbia. But it was a hopeless battle at that point in time. There was nothing they could do but retreat. Okay, next slide, John. All right, here's another version of it. This is from the bottom portion. You're looking from the Confederate side, and you see sort of a U shape there. I believe that's where Gary was standing during part of that presentation. Now, that was designed for a specific purpose. Below that is a fairly low-lying area that goes into a tributary that feeds Congaree Creek. And the reason they built it in sort of a V shape was to have a firing zone that would be very difficult for the Union troops to conquer, whether they had 1,000 or 2,000. It gave the Confederates a great firing point, and the Confederates were at a disadvantage. Can you see how the earthworks go? Now, another factor about the earthworks, they were intended to go all the way from Congaree Creek to the Saluda River. Well, they ran out of both time and personnel, and so what we have is that 1.5 miles, and that's all it was. But it would have gone even farther had they had the manpower, the weather conditions, and the ability to slow Sherman down even farther.
And Chuck, this map shows the earthworks, which is a contemporaneous sketch drawn right after the battle by the Union officer going all the way over to the river. Those, we don't think those exist anymore. Those have been washed away.
Yeah, those were most likely washed away. Remember, this was farmland, and one of the things that it offered the settlers there was constant flooding just about every year from the Saluda and Broad and Congaree rivers, and it dumped a lot of very rich silt from upstate into that area, which made it ideal for crops, but not very ideal for fighting a battle. Now, back in the 50s, the trees that you see there, back in the 50s, the family that owned it, I believe it was a Taylor family, planted pine trees, because pine trees and turpentine were a very big staple crop. And so they took advantage of that. And of course, that has created a false image of what the battlefield looked like with all the trees there. Plus, you've got natural hardwoods like oak and hickory and some maples and things like that. Any questions? Okay. Let's go back to the next.
I do have a question.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
You're talking about 1850 when they planted the pines, before 1850?
No. This was the 1950s.
1950s.
Yes.
Still into turpentine at that time?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Some of them may have been planted prior to that, but the information I had says that they were really grown mature trees. Well, I guess they did have to be planted before that then, because in the 50s they were full-grown trees that were able to do the turpentine. That was way back before we had water-based paint and latex. So all painters still use turpentine to thin their paints and clean their paintbrushes. Okay, good question there. All right, as you can see, the design of the earthworks, it was basically a pyramid, but on one side it was notched. There was a firing post, and as you can see in the photograph, it allowed the soldiers to fire, squat down, reload their rifles, pop back up, and fire again. I'll get to a little bit more of this when we show the information about the armaments and so forth. But I will tell you, during the Civil War, saw the greatest advances in weaponry in all of history prior to that point. Prior to then, most guns were muskets or shotguns, and they were breech loaders, muzzle loaders. So even the best sharpshooter on the Confederate side and the Union side could only fire about 2 rounds per minute. Really, really good, might be able to get off 3 rounds per minute by loading that rifle. You can see the man down in the lower right, left-hand corner. The way those guns are loaded, you have to first of all put some powder in, you put a patch in, then you put a musket ball, and then you tamp it all down with a rod. Then you're able to pull the hammer back and fire. There were 2 types of fire. There was a flintlock firing mechanism, and there was a powder pan. Both of them were designed so that the exploding powder or the spark from the flintlock would ignite the powder in the barrel, therefore discharging the weapon and moving the projectile out of the barrel. I have personally never tried doing that. It's something I hope to do at some point in time, but since I don't own a muzzle loader, that may be a while. Okay, does everybody get that? Archaeological investigations. That is a site that is rich in history. In fact, history that goes back at least 12,000 years. That's the name of the history park, 12,000-year history park, because we do have archaeological evidence that there were inhabitants there at least 12,000 years ago, but there is some more recent evidence, according to Leo Redmond, formerly of the Casey Museum, that it may go back as far as 13,000 years, but we're not going to change the name of the park for that. Anyway, probably the most archaeological investigations have been done by individuals with the devices you see there, the metal detectors. However, the University of South Carolina, John, you have to help me on that, the National Park Service, and I think 2 other entities have done some archaeological research there. So not only have they found evidence of the battle at Congaree Creek, but they found evidence of civilizations there.
Yeah, Chuck, we have found artifacts that are related to prehistoric occupations of Native Americans, and we found lots of artifacts associated with the 1718 fort and trading post that was there. But we've just scratched the surface of our archaeological investigations of sites in the park, probably just a 1 or 2% sample so far. So we have a lot to look forward to in terms of archaeological research.
Right. Okay, any questions? All right, let's go to the next slide. This is an illustration of some of the areas that have been cleared and metal detected. And again, we emphasize that not only did they find remnants from the battle, but they found pottery and other things that indicate the previous civilizations. John, did you have something to say? Okay.
This map is of when we were seeing what we could find with metal detecting of especially those Civil War related, the battlefield related artifacts. We also, in the process though, came up with other artifacts, metal, even some associated with the 18th century. But these are the green X's are the fine locations of the artifacts that we'll show, some of the artifacts that we'll show in the next slides.
Okay. All right. Okay, let's talk about the weapons and ammunition used. The Union had a lot more money than the Confederacy did. Therefore, they were able to do a much better job of procuring the most recent and most effective types of firearms, including muskets, rifles, and handguns. Both sides went to Europe because at that point in time, the weapons manufacturing in the United States was pretty small. The Confederates tended to favor the British Enfield rifles, but both places went to England, France, Germany, wherever they could find, and they went to the manufacturers of these guns, and they bought as much as they could. The Confederacy would go and they would buy as much as they had money to purchase. The Union would go into a factory and say, we'll take your entire next year's production. For the most part, the Confederate soldiers used the muzzle loaders. There were a handful of the Sharps rifles, but they were still greatly outnumbered. Now, you can see the ball ammunition. It's changed quite a bit. Originally, it was just a round ball that looked like a bearing made out of lead. The barrels were smooth, so the accuracy was greatly diminished. In the 1850s era and a little bit prior to that, they started putting grooves in the rifle barrels. Now, the groove caused the bullet to spin as it went down the barrel, imparting centrifugal force, which greatly enhanced the range of the bullet as well as the accuracy. And you can see below there some of the different types of bullets. Most of these are referred to as mini balls. Okay, any questions? All right, let's go to the next one. Okay, this one is a Spencer repeating rifle. They didn't have very many of these, if any at all, at the Battle of Congaree Creek on the Confederate side. The Union soldiers had a combination of these. It's probably not likely the Unions had very many muskets themselves, but they had these. The difference is these were loaded from the back. If you look where the hammer is on that rifle, below that is an opening where you were able to insert bullets into a tube underneath the barrel. It's pretty much covered up by the wood right now, but that is how you loaded those. That was a great improvement over the muskets and smooth bore. It did have the bored out barrels too. Okay, any questions? Okay. Wait a minute, John, go back to the previous slide. There we go. We don't have the slide that shows all of them. One of the great advantages that the Union had was they were able to purchase these Spencer rifles, but they were also able to get the Henry rifles. When you think of a classic lever action rifle, most people think of a Winchester Model 94 or 92 or something like that. But Henry was the first successfully to use a lever action to load and discharge the weapon. Their Henry rifles were 44 caliber and they carried about 16 rounds inside. The Spencer, I think, carried either 7 or 8 rounds. Now you compare that with being able to fire 7 or 16 rounds at one time without reloading, with the Confederates having to reload their rifles and muskets every time they fired. And you can see a significant weapon superiority on the Union side. Okay, you can go back to the other one, John. All right, this is a picture of an Enfield, probably a .577 caliber. That was the weapon that was favored and used by most of the Confederate soldiers at Congaree Creek in other battles. And again, they used the mini ball type ammunition. All of these things you see here, these examples of bullets, were examples of things that were found through metal detecting and other archaeological efforts. And there are probably many, many more out there, but just be aware that it is against the law to dig up and remove anything from that site.
Yeah, the city of Casey has an archaeological ordinance similar to what the rules are of the National Park Service, where only authorized people can, no one is authorized to take things off the park or dig things up.
Yes. So if you happen to be out there visiting and you come across something, do not remove it. I would say as quickly as possible, notify John or someone at the Casey Museum. And they would get the right action going. Okay, anything else? All right, let's look at some cannons. Again, I mentioned that the Union troops had vastly superior cannons. The one in the sort of amber color, that is what we think that the Confederates had. That's either a 10 or 12 pound Napoleon style cannon. You can see that the ones that the Union troops in the gray photos were significantly bigger and longer. The longer the barrel, the farther it could shoot. The wider the barrel opening, the bigger round they could shoot. Now, there were several different types of ammunition that were used in these cannons. One of it was solid shot, just a round iron ball. Those were used quite effectively at the Battle of Fort Sumter. They were used to knock down the bricks and mortar, and they're quite effective. It's like taking a sledgehammer to masonry. Now, those had minimal effect on troops. And so one of the other types of canisters, ammunition they put in the cannons was canisters. Basically, that was a handful of small round balls, basically like a ball bearing, but made out of lead or iron. And it, in essence, converted that cannon into a large shotgun. That was quite effective against personnel on a battlefield. Sometimes they didn't have those balls, so they would put the powder in and they would just put whatever metal they could find, pieces of ironworks or whatever they could round up. They may have even put some pottery in there at times, and that also became a version of a shotgun. Then there was another type that was it was a hollowed out ball with a fuse in the top. The fuse looked somewhat like a cigar, but they would put those in the cannon. There was black powder inside of those balls, and they would light that fuse. And they knew from experience how long to cut that fuse. And so they would light the fuse, fire the ball, and it was designed to either explode over the heads of the opposing troops or as it hit the ground. So there were 4 different types of projectiles that came out of those cannons on both sides. Any questions?
I have an ignorant question.
There are no ignorant questions. Maybe uninformed, but not ignorant.
So when that hollow ball with the fuse exploded,
Yes.
the ball actually flew into pieces?
Yes, and we're going to show you a picture of some of those pieces in a minute. But yeah,
So
it was just like any bomb.
Okay.
It would blow the fragments, big and small, all over the place. And depending on the size of the charge, it depended on how big the fragments would be spread. Obviously, a 12-pound cannon was going to have more stuff and more distance around the actual impact area than a 10-pound or an 8-pound.
So it actually hurt with shrapnel?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what killed the people, was the shrapnel. You can imagine it would be like a bunch of bullets, but it's just ragged instead of the nicely formed mini balls that we showed you earlier.
We're going to show you some fragments that Chuck mentioned that were found out there by the archaeologists.
Well, remember, because of the field conditions, it's not likely they were able to get the cannons up close enough to really be effective. And they were probably firing from a much greater distance than they normally would have fired on dry ground. And so my suspicion is that a great many of the cannonballs and shot that were fired fell short of their mark. Okay, any other uninformed questions?
Me.
Okay.
Did you say the Confederates only had the Napoleon style?
Yes, and records that I have seen only show that they had 2 of them, and they had one on either side of that tete de pont. There is some indication that there was one Parrott gun, which was probably maybe like a 3-inch diameter shell. Oh, by the way, the term 12-pounder, 10-pounder, 8-pounder referred to the weight of the cannonball itself.
Chuck, I think the photo on top is of a 3-inch ordnance cannon, I believe.
Oh, that may be it. Yeah.
Yeah, that was an
Okay.
actual photograph.
I see that now. I didn't look at it real closely, but that does look like a Parrott gun. But it was a rifle barrel, and these Napoleon cannons were smooth barrel, so they didn't have the kind of accuracy that Parrott gun had. And later on, as they made cannons more sophisticated, they went to the rifle barrel too. But the majority of the ones that were used at Congaree Creek Battle were smoothbore. And of course, it took a team to fire those cannons. There was like 3 or 4 people. There was one person that put the powder in. There was one person that put the padding in. There was one person that put the ball in and rammed it down. There was one person that set the charge, and there was one person that fired it. Now, they used a string or cord, and so they stood away from it. They didn't want to risk the thing blowing up on their head or blowing up and blowing off their head. So they used a cord in order to fire that thing.
Chuck, as an aside, the rifled cannon were very important. Of course, they had been around for a few years by 1865, but in the early part of the war, they were brought in and demonstrated that all these masonry forts that the government had been building after the War of 1812, like Fort Pulaski, Fort Sumter, were obsolete because these rifled cannons could penetrate the bricks and the masonry. So all the forts, all of a sudden, when Fort Pulaski fell in Savannah, when they knocked down the wall there with these rifled cannon, they immediately started, all the forts were earthen forts after that. So just as an aside, the importance of these rifled cannon.
Okay. All right, here we go. Now, here are some fragments from the shells. You ask about, did it break into pieces? Yes, it did break into pieces. They were big pieces and small pieces. And those are from the particular type of cannon that you see right there. And I'm pretty certain these are all from the hollow cannonballs with the black powder inside of them. Then at the lower right-hand side, you see picture D. That's what the canister balls look like, and essentially turned a cannon into a large shotgun. Now, these have been found all over the place. I think there's an image next that shows where some of these, yes, it shows where it was found. Okay, here we go. In the blue is ammunition that was fired. Let's see. That was probably would have been just a projectile. Unfired, John, I'm assuming, is the whole canister and cannonball and everything intact. Okay. There we go. Went back. There. The yellow indicates shells. Now, these are artillery shells. And some were intact and some were not. The orange ones that you see, well, go forward again, John. Yeah. So they found both fired ammunition or expended ammunition and that had been fired. All right, next slide, John. Okay. This is rifle ammunition that was found there. So you can see approximately where the greatest concentration of fire was during that battle based on the number of projectiles that were found through whatever efforts, either metal detecting or archaeology.
And these were determined to be Confederate ammunition fired.
Right. Yes. That's probably why you see so much more of the Union ammunition, because they had a lot more ammo and a lot more people. Okay, here's another indication. Again, these are the artillery fragments. And here's all ammunition. So there was a lot of shooting going on. Now, you might think with all that shooting going on, there would have been a lot of casualties. To the best of our knowledge, there were only a few Union soldiers killed and only 1 or 2 Confederate troops killed. There was one report that is, we kind of considered an urban legend, that there was a Confederate colonel, a cavalry officer, that died in the battle, but he was drunk during the battle and fell off of his horse. We don't have any way of proving or disproving that theory, but it is a story from that battle. Casualties were very low.
How much were horses used?
The Confederates really didn't do much. Their cavalry was dismounted. They showed up at the battle on horses, but they dismounted and participated in the battle just like the regular soldiers. Now, the Union, because of the battlefield conditions, probably did not get much use out of their cavalry except as reconnaissance. They're the ones that found the opening along Congaree Creek where the trees had fallen across and the conditions were a little bit better. Water may not have been quite as high. But the cavalry on the Confederate side was not used at all in the traditional cavalry sense. The Union used theirs mainly for reconnaissance. Remember, there were no people on the battlefield for the cavalry to really fight. And that brings up another point. In military terminology, in order to call a action like this a battle, they have to have several things in existence. Obviously, you've got to have opponents. Secondly, you have to have cannons involved. And there were cannons involved on both sides, although not a great deal. And the third was you had to have cavalry involved in order to officially call it a battle. Otherwise, they call it a skirmish or an action. Now, that's military terminology, and John and I gentlemanly disagree a little bit on that, but it's okay. All right, any other questions? All right, let's go to the thing about the earthworks. Okay, Gary told you a good bit about that, but let me tell you what is missing. The Confederate generals and the architects of the earthworks initially wanted 2,000 slaves. Well, let's put yourself in the position of a plantation owner. You've got fields to plow, you've got crops to plant soon. How likely are you to turn loose of your slaves to go build an earthworks? Not very likely. In the end, even though they sent out the letter and they got a small handful on that first day, they actually had to go out to the plantations and farms where the slaves were and actually conscript them and take them to the battlefield. As it turns out, they eventually got about 750 slaves, but slaves and some free African people that were put into service and responsible for building that. Considering the conditions they had, considering that they only had shovels and pickaxes and things of that nature, they did a fabulous job to have built 1.5 miles of earthworks in such a short period of time. It was absolutely incredible. I'm not even sure that we could do that with backhoes and graders and things like that today. Too much regulations and rules to follow. Now, another thing, go back to the earthworks. The moat in front of the earthworks was not designed to put water in. It was designed to make a trench so that the Union troops had to go down and then come back up. And as they were doing that, it gave the Confederates behind the wall of the earthworks an opportunity to just pop up, shoot them, and leave them there. Did I mention it rained 38 out of 45 days prior to the Battle of Congaree Creek?
Yes.
I did. Well, where do you think that water stayed? So even though it was not designed to have a boat full of water, it most certainly did during the Battle of Congaree Creek. Now, this sign that you see is a monument, a tribute to those slaves and freed African Americans that actually built it. They did an incredible job, and they certainly can be proud of that. Okay, John, next. These are some pictures of one of the the lantern tours. We can really only do those in the fall and winter months because daylight savings time kind of messes us up. And it's a little hard to have a lantern tour when you got bright daylight looking down on you. These are some pictures of women. These are, I guess you'd call them reenactors, that are talking about conditions during the 1700s, 18th century, at the Congaree Creek area, which would have been Casey, West Columbia today. They're talking about what life was like then and what they had to do. And hopefully once we get this COVID under control, we will go back to having these lantern tours and the live tours.
One of the things, Chuck, that this particular stop at our tour is meant to point out is the panic and the havoc that was going on in the city as a result. And of course, it was mostly women that had to face that. So that's right. A story about their hardships.
Yeah. Remember, their husbands that were in the Confederate Army were north, somewhere near Richmond. Okay, move along. Okay, here is a reenactment of what life was kind of like around the campfire there. We actually have some really good reenactors that help us out with these the candlelight, the lantern tours, as well as the walk to Fort Congaree. All right, this is an inspiring sight. It's impressive to see cannon go off during the daytime, but at night when you see the fire and the flames and the smoke coming out, it's even more impressive. And we do from time to time allow visitors to set off the cannon. And you can see the rifles stacked there. We do have a small exhibit. It'd be nice if we had a bigger one, but we always have someone that is there in Confederate and Union uniforms with a tent like they would have had at that time. One thing I want to point out here is you see the trail there. The trail is handicap accessible for the most part. So if you want to come out and take a tour of the facilities, just walk on the trail, you can walk, you can bike, but it's very accessible to a large number of people. These are two reenactors in obviously Union attire. All right, there is what appears to be a cannon team and some officers. And that is the type of cannon that they would have had at the Congaree Creek battle on the Confederate side. See, that's not really all that big compared to the things that the Union had.
Yeah, Chuck, these are a number of volunteers that have helped us a great deal in setting up the camp scene and also in some of the programs as role players. So we're really grateful for their participation.
Are these the guys from Charleston?
No, they're local from South Carolina. They come from parts of South Carolina to do these reenactments.
I recognize some of the faces, and a few of those guys told me that they do reenactments of battles all over the place, not just in South Carolina.
That's true. They have a regular round. You know, before COVID, I would have to give them a far ahead notice to make sure that they were available to help us out on the tours in the park. But they also have specialized in reenacting the Battle of Congaree Creek. So now that used to be done off-site. Now they actually do their work on the actual battlefield, which I think gives it a lot more authenticity, and I think they enjoy doing that.
Yeah, that was the Battle of Sandy Run that they used to do.
Well, they did Congaree Creek. They also did Sandy Run. But it was done off site.
Right.
I once took my students to the Battle of Congaree Creek, and it was far away. I don't remember where it was, but it was cavalry. I mean, they had the horses, they were running through the forest. It was a very rainy day. We were the only ones there to observe it, but it was very cool.
Okay. That's the end of our slides. I invite you to go to our website at kc12000years.com, where our virtual agenda is posted for the fall in our Facebook page. We will be next up for our programs. Our virtual programs is on December 1st, where we'll be talking about trade in the 18th century, a day in the life of a typical household. And we'll be joined in that program by Fennell of the Lexington County Museum. And then on the 3rd of December, we're having a really interesting program from the archaeologists at USC Lancaster. Chris Judge especially will be talking about the origin and history of the Congaree Indians. So stay tuned to our agenda and email me or contact me if you have questions about it. But those are the next two virtual programs that we haven't planned. So at this point, I think, are there any follow-up questions on what we've talked about either on the videos or the slides today?
I just wanted to say thanks, Chuck. You were very easy to hear. We could see your pictures. It was great.
Well, Chuck's a star, that's for sure. We appreciate all our volunteers. Of course, it's the volunteer giving up their time. We rely on Chuck to come in and talk about some of the details of the battle and other parts of the story. So thank you, Chuck. Any other comments or questions?
Just one other thing, John. I also write for the Lexington County Chronicle newspaper, and I try to give the 12,000 Year History Park as much publicity as we can. But I just want to remind folks that November is also Native American Heritage Month. And one of the tours that we give at the 12,000 Year History Park is a Native American tour. And we have a couple of guys, one is a Choctaw descendant, one is a Cherokee descendant, who do a fabulous job of recreating life in that time 10, 12,000 years ago, and even more recently. So I will have a story in the Chronicle next week about Native American Heritage Month, and I do mention the 12,000 Year History Park a bit.
Yeah, and we have high hopes of being able to resume our in-person tours, hopefully by March. And stay tuned to our website for information about that, including Native American. We'll have a couple of other programs on nature in the park too. And we'll probably have, we're gonna try to have a reenactment of the, get those volunteers, those role players back in to do a role-playing tour where they come and dress up and show off their cannon and fire their cannon. So please stay tuned to what we can do when we get back out in the park.
Okay. Thanks for putting this together, John. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck, so much. Thank Gary for his video. The videos don't seem to come through as well because I think of the various Wi-Fi speeds that people have, but hopefully we are recording this, so we will be posting links to the recording of the session. Thanks everybody for attending, and we'll see you next time on December 1st when we talk about the 18th century and the life of a typical household. Take care and have a good weekend.
Hi, John.
Bye-bye.